Howdy, BHRCers. You can find every episode of Why People on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you find your podcast content. On this episode of Why People, episode number 7, we're thrilled to have Ann Lazarus-Barnes, the Chief People Officer of Lionbridge, with us. Ann is well known in the Northeast region for being an amazing HR executive. We get to talk about her past, her present, and her future relative to the HR space. Let's do it. All right. Welcome in, BHRC. For those of you joining us, the Boston HR Council is the largest HR and people executive community in the world, and Why People is the Boston HR Council podcast. I'd like to introduce the co-founder of the Boston HR Council and the co-host of Why People, Paul Roberts.
Good day, everyone. Happy to be here, and thanks for joining us. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Very catchy tune. I love the intro.
All credit goes to Paul. Anything creative is Paul Roberts. And excited to introduce our guest today. Ann Lazarus-Barnes is the Chief People Officer of Lionbridge, which is a really awesome technology firm here in the Boston area. But Ann, I'll turn it over to you. Again, thanks for joining us, but would love to hear just a little bit about you, a little bit about your background, and set the foundation for a great conversation today.
Yeah, sure. So I am the Chief People Officer of Lionbridge, which you mentioned. We're a mid-sized technology services firm based in Waltham, Massachusetts. But we do have over 5,000 employees in 28 countries. And our job, and again, I reference this as a cool company, our job is we localize everything. We transform content. Transform content so it resonates. We test content, products, and services in every language on every device. We create content. We interpret in 350 languages, 24/7, 365, all the time. We have got a list of really enviable logos from the premier technology companies, life sciences, product companies. We also have a number of video gaming companies that we do work for, and I immediately had street credibility with my nephews who are big gamers by virtue of the gaming companies with whom we do business. I personally have over 38 years of increasing responsibility in human resources. I began as a personnel assistant at the Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary on Storrow Drive, back when it was a personnel department and not a human resources department. I've made my way through college relations and college recruiting, HRBP with a lot of employee relations, global benefits, succession planning, talent management, executive compensation and benefits, total rewards, and DEI. So I have both been in those as a regular full-time job or led all of those. I've worked for Fortune 50, Fortune 100, not on Fortune lists anywhere. I've been with publicly held companies, private equity-backed companies, and then I've worked in industries, everything from retail to call center operations, banking, briefly, and the education technology industry. And now I'm at Lionbridge, which again, is a technology services firm responsible for translation and interpretation to our clients so that they can reach our customers.
Wow. Well, Ann, thanks for the background. Paul and I, lucky enough to know you and knew a lot of that. I didn't know all of it. Didn't know where you started, but that's amazing. So it sets a great foundation for our conversation today, Ann. Right. So Why People? This podcast, we're essentially kind of walking through the same lens with all of the executive peers that we have on, but of course everyone's journey is so different, right? So the background is perfect. So just given that, and I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about your formative years relative to schooling and if you ever had some type of gut feeling at some point in those years that what you're doing now was going to be what you were passionate about?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start you out at the beginning, and then we'll kind of get there. So I grew up on the Jersey Shore long before Snooki and JWoww and DJ Pauly, and long before hair gel and suntan lotion and clubbing. We had Bruce Springsteen, we had the beach clubs, and we had great body surfing, but long before what people think of now as the
A different Pauly D, right? Different DJ Pauly. Make sure that for our audience, different Pauly, DJ Pauly.
Correct. I spent all my summers in Maine, and then I went away to college at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. I was a Russian and history major, double major. And then, as I mentioned, I started my career in Boston. If I look back at my upbringing, I have always really worked, and it was instilled in me from a very young age. I had the very good fortune of growing up in some privilege as a result of a father who was very successful on Wall Street. And he and my mom instilled in me and my sisters, and I am the youngest of 5 girls, no brothers, that work is really important, and that the reward of a thing well done is having done it, which, is a principle that I grew up with. And it wasn't necessarily spoken, but it was just expected, right? So I started dog walking in the neighborhood at the age of 8, where neighbors would leave a key for me to go into their house, go get their dogs, put them on a leash and walk them around the neighborhood. I think I got a nickel a walk. I was making submarine sandwiches at Bobby T's on Route 35 in Shrewsbury, New Jersey. I was a waitress. I was a bartender. I even worked at the Trinity College Library, which I will say, I think I romanticized what that job was going to be. I was horrible at it, and learned a great deal. Sometimes you learn from the jobs you're not good at. That was one I definitely learned. Not good at detail and not good at process. But my point is that I almost always held responsibility to show up, to do a good job, to get along with the team, to get to know people who may not have been like me. And there was real value in that from a human resources perspective. I also think that being from a family of all girls with a father who was successful on Wall Street, he is a 93, remains a kind of a man's man, right? And I think some of that is also generational. But the cool thing about being a daughter of a person like that, and only having daughters, is he taught all of us how to play pickle, how to kick a football, how to mow a lawn, what are the rules of ice hockey, and he cheered from the sidelines when I played rugby at Trinity, although I will say he turned his back an awful lot because of all the orthodontia that he paid for and concern over my teeth. But he was always a cheerleader and taught us what I think were traditionally kind of boy things. And I think as a result of that, he instilled in me a sense of confidence and some fearlessness. The fact that I was playing rugby, I started one of the first women's rugby teams in Scotland when I was studying abroad. And I kind of didn't understand, what was the big deal? Of course women can play rugby, right? So I credit my dad and his treatment of his daughters as just, human beings who can do what everyone else can do. With instilling in me a certain sense of confidence. I think my mom, who was an artist, instilled in me a love of reading, a love of travel, the idea of immersing yourself in worlds, whether they're real or fictional, right? Whether it's through reading or travel, just really getting into the world that you're going to be a part of observing, of creating, and kind of an overall intellectual curiosity about people, places, and things, right? And so there was this lovely balance between my mother and father. Full disclosure, I will say that in many respects, my upbringing was really enviable, and I am very remarkable in so many respects. I will say that my parents, and my mother in particular, struggled with alcoholism. Not only struggled, my mother was an alcoholic. And I think being a child of an alcoholic, and this may resonate with some of the listeners, is I think as a result of that, I have a capability to read a room faster than other people, because I think as a child of an alcoholic, you learn who you're dealing with very quickly, or you learn to pick up cues that others may not be as aware of. And I think that that's actually served me very well in human resources. The other thing it does is it means that you can have a conversation with somebody and read between the lines a lot more, or at least look for the message that's underneath what they're trying to say. And again, combined with that fearlessness, being able to say, I hear what you're saying, but I hear something differently, right? Like having very open discussions. So being empathetic and also having a fearlessness has served me really well. The other thing I think that happens when you grow up in the family like I did is you grow up with a certain sense of optimism that today's going to be a better day, because you have to. You have to believe that that person that's struggling with alcoholism is going to have a better day today. And optimism has absolutely served me well in my career and served me well in human resources. I think business, I prefer to work with people who generally are optimistic. I work with a CEO now. He's a terrific person. And we sometimes joke around that, a good day is when fewer bad things happen, right? It's just a very positive way to look at business and think about, sometimes business is hard, but generally remaining in super resilient about whatever is happening around you tends to be the culture that I prefer. And it makes sense if you look at how I grew up.
Well, first, really appreciate you sharing that about your childhood. I'd imagine a lot of folks listening in will resonate with that. And really interesting to hear how you feel like it shaped your ability to do certain things that are important to everyone, but certainly in the top HR and people position at an organization. So thanks. That's amazing. And so kind of thinking what you shared and go Bantams, and I know a lot of folks from Trinity. This is always interesting to me. And you mentioned on the intro that when you started in the function, it really was personnel. I mean, it has evolved. So I guess my question is any part of it in what you shared there? So you shared kind of what shaped your character relative to the role, but was there anything, maybe school or a person? Seems like your dad was influential from a business perspective, but just curious as far as you getting set on the path of personnel, HR, people, was there anything there that kind of pushed you there? Would you argue that you didn't know at that point? Just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it seems like ancient history. But what Trinity College has got a great career development office. I was late to the party. I love college. I was, rowing and playing rugby, and I had really good friends, and I was doing semesters abroad, and so I think I wandered in April of my senior year. Like, hey, I think I'm supposed to get a job, and I knew my parents were super supportive, but once college ended, you were not expected to go back home. Like that was a foreign, you were expected to go out and launch, and do what you were going to do. And Trinity, bless them, immediately got working on, what do you think you want to do? And I had a number of interviews, two different paths. One was Wall Street, which was very familiar to me and, somewhat comfortable. And the other was kind of the idea of national security agencies, right? Because I had this Russian background, and there were batteries of tests that you had to go through and multiple levels to become even eligible to interview, which I passed many of those and went on to interview both for Wall Street as well as the security organizations. And what I found, and I found that I was much more interested in why I was being asked the questions I was than the jobs themselves. And I really, and particularly when looking at the security organizations, these battery of tests, I just thought it was I sort of wondered, why are they asking me these questions about, do I prefer to work during the morning or they were more about your preferences and your style and your competencies. And I didn't, at the time, I didn't understand that's what they were doing, but I was fascinated by the questions that they were asking. And the same for the Wall Street firms also, kind of what were you willing to, could you, not only did you understand finance, but were you willing to put in the 20-hour days or, whatever it was that they were selling at that point when it came to Wall Street. So that was a pivotal moment. So again, I will admit I was late to the party. I was not one of those people that went to Trinity knowing I was going to be in human resources, unlike many of my friends who were very directed in terms of what their career path was. But thankfully, to the Career Development Center, having had exposure to a lot of interviews, first, second, and third round, and some offers, much to my parents' chagrin that I turned down, I realized what I was interested in is why are they asking me the questions they're asking me? And that's what led me to human resources, luckily.
That was fascinating, Ann. I mean, geez, to be a young 20-something, and even I think to identify that was where the curiosity was being led right during the interview process is really cool. I love the background there, Ann, and it kind of brings us now. I think we'll kind of move from the past, if you will, and kind of talk about your career. Your journey a little bit, and we'll lean into a couple of different spots and a couple of different inflection points. So, just curious, Ann. So you've talked to us about kind of through college, right, and how your brain kind of started steering towards the people track. Tell us a little bit about that springboard moment, right, of kind of jumping into what was personnel and what your initial feelings were and kind of how that felt.
Yeah. So I started at the lowest position possible, I think, in any HR department, which was formative, right? Like there's no shame in being a personnel assistant at the time, right? Where we were still dealing with paper files, and I was responsible for onboarding employees, and I think I had to plan the Christmas party. It was really basic stuff, but it gave me an idea of the at that point, or what is now considered relatively low value work. But it was the right place to start out, because human resources, I think each role that I had built on the previous role. So nonetheless, so I spent about not even quite a year doing that, and then moved on to college relations. Again, part of that was I kind of fit the profile of a college recruiter, right? Going out on campus, having only been on campus a year previously, and trying to encourage people to join the firm I was with at that point, and getting to know professors and coming up with ways to build our reputation on campus as an employer of choice in a at that point, very competitive college relations environment. And then again, on to hire more complex recruiting, and then ultimately leading a recruiting team. At some point, I moved to one of the large retailers, and became an HRBP, which was the first time that I really had to deal with employee relations and the humanity of business, and the notion of individuals. It was before diversity was diversity. Kind of like, why aren't people just getting along? Like, you're part of the same team. Why are people leaving the company? What can we do to engender a sense of belonging? And then also helping the organization realize how, again, the business of human resources. So if we had, for instance, a certain amount of attrition, then how much of recruiting do we have to do? What's the cost per hire? What's the cost per exit? Really getting my first taste of business strategy when it comes to human resources. I'm going to say, I apologize. I have a bulldog at my feet. She's snoring. I don't know whether you can pick it up on the microphone, but I will say I'm trying to kick her to keep her awake, and it's not working. So
we just thought you were very hungry, and I thought it was your stomach growling.
He's done this more times than I care to. Very serious business conversations, and you hear this loud snoring in the background. Anyway, I did want to mention, and it's related to my career, I did end up in a role where I was doing compensation and benefits for a very large call center operation, 90,000 people worldwide. I was one of very few people dealing with compensation and benefits. And I encourage everyone, if you're thinking of becoming a leader of HR, to spend time in those areas, because those are the levers that HR has a lot of financial control over, and very direct control over. And understanding benefits and compensation, and particularly executive compensation, was critical to my ability to become ultimately the leader of an HR team. Without that, and I think it's an area that is so specialized sometimes that individuals not discount it, but they think, well, I don't have the background for that. I didn't have the background for it, but I did it. And I learned a lot. And I learned from people who were really steeped in compensation and benefits, who worked for me. And I had the wherewithal to understand that leading an area doesn't mean that you necessarily know everything about the area, and that a leader actually remains just as intellectually curious as everybody else. And it's perfectly acceptable to spend time, for instance, with somebody who's well steeped in compensation, and spend time with them understanding what they do and how they do it, so that you in turn can interpret that work for the benefit of the leaders of the business. Many times when I talk to people who are interested in human resources, they talk a lot about, I like working with people, or I want to recruit talent. There are some parts of human resources that I think are very, people assume are the leader pieces of HR. But I will tell you, in my background, the time that I spent in benefits and comp were the most formative for me. And again, I just encourage everyone who's thinking about trying to become an HR leader to spend time in those two areas. The other word of wisdom I would give you is, not that you asked for words of wisdom, but I'll give it to you anyway, get to know your CFO really well. The chief financial officer in 3 companies that I worked in started out a little rocky in terms of the relationship, because, you think about humans versus finances, like how can you ever get in sync? But actually linking arms with the CFO and having the respect of the CFO, and vice versa, respecting the CFO, is really critical to your ability to get work done and get initiatives done. The other thing I will say is you need to be able to speak the language of business. And that's why that time in benefits and comp was so critical for me, because I could then very easily translate everything that I was doing as an HR leader into financials, right? And that has made a significant difference in my ability, whether it's talking to the board or working with different leaders at Lionbridge, or even working with leaders at our client companies who will call me and ask for advice and counsel. Being able to speak the language of business, not just the language of HR, really important for a leader.
Yeah, no, I love that that guidance, and it kind of brings us into our next question. It's interesting. So we've kind of talked about your career and kind of how it started pathing. Curious, relative, you starting in personnel, you shared 38 years. Can you tell the audience a little bit about when you started to feel the shift? And I don't know if it was the shift in your roles or the shift in the function in general, but when did HR come to be more strategic than transactional? When over the course of your career, were you able to say, hey, I'm not just putting together onboarding, files. I'm actually thinking like a true business person. How did you get there? What did it feel like, and what was it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it as I was reflecting on preparing for this time with you, I think for me, I don't know whether from an industry perspective when kind of that shift occurred, although if you give me a little bit of time, I can figure it out. But what I will tell you is I consciously sought out companies where HR was considered strategic, right? And again, I think my confidence and a little bit of that fearlessness probably has something to do with that. Wasn't going to work with any company. I wasn't going to work with any company that didn't value what I had to say or what I was bringing to the company or even with being able to talk about the return on investment or the financials or whatever it might be, I needed to know that I was working with a company that valued that. And one thing I'm going to mention here, and I think some of it is being a senior female, I have been described, yes, as fearless. I've also been told I had moxie. And, to this day, I'm pretty sure it was not a compliment. I also have been told I'm too emotional. I've been told to lose the righteousness. I have been told that the only difference between aggressive and assertive is gender. And again, pointed directly at me and not meant as a compliment. And what I can tell you is that each time a comment like that was made or was pervasive in the environment that I was in, I made an ultimate decision to seek out other companies where, my talent, my moxie, my righteousness, my emotional being, my assertiveness would be more appreciated. And those were moments for me that were pivotal, right? Where it was a little, it's always hard to make a change, but where I really just felt that, like, if it's not resonating for the culture and it is who I am, then it's time for me to leave. And I will say too, and I know I talked about optimism previously, but I do think sometimes women in the workplace have a learned hopefulness where they're just going to manage that environment. And I think that's a really dangerous thing, and maybe it isn't just women. I tend to see it more in women, but this idea that I'll just manage and I'll just stay and it'll get better. I think that there's a danger in not leaving a bad boss or a sick culture. And so for me, those pivotal moments were when I recognized that I was somewhere that wasn't going to work for me, where HR wasn't strategic, or where my initiatives weren't valued like other things were valued within the company. And so I will say, I do think that there are HR departments that still operate as personnel departments, right? And there's still HR people that don't speak the language of business. And those are not necessarily the role model organizations that I would aspire to be part of, were I starting out my career.
No, thank you, Ann, and thanks for highlighting kind of some of what you were feeling in some of those situations. I think it's helpful for our audience to hear that, especially folks that might be, in similar situations. A question I want to ask you, and based on what you've shared, and the Boston HR Council has over 1,000 of your executive peers, CHROs, chief people officers, VPs of HRs, and even some larger director folks. A question that comes up a lot is, or insight that's shared, I should say, Ann, is as you kind of move up that executive path, it's often shared with us that the amount of things that you're responsible for, or the amount of items on your to-do list, or fill in the blank, gets wider and wider. And so a question I have for you is, you've done some amazing things at some amazing places. How do you think of it from a personal and professional standpoint with all the things I'm sure you've had to balance during work and outside of work? It's something that comes up a lot when people are thinking, do I have the chops or the capacity to move up that ladder?
Yeah, I'll try to answer this succinctly. The interesting thing is that if I look at some of my best years professionally, like where I was really moving fast and upward quickly, they also coincided with some of the most demanding personally. I was, for a long stretch, I was a single and working mother, no child support, no alimony. And I didn't have a choice but to work. And maybe part of the drive there was because I had to, there was no choice. So I think that when I consider the breadth of what human resources is, I have also found that the times that are, again, the most challenging, or where you have the most to do, at least for me, are the most rewarding. And not just rewarding financially, but rewarding, again, that job well done quote that I gave with Emerson. Like, there's something to be said when you are both, divesting a very large part of the company and recruiting talent and, revising a 401k plan. And like, there's just an excitement to the level of work and the breadth of work that you're asked to do as the head of HR. And again, I certainly found that when I was balancing work and family, even as a single mom, which I think may be the most challenging personally and professionally at the same time. But again, I look back on it now and I realize, wow, I actually accomplished more. It's kind of like, I don't know about you, but in college, my best GPA always happened when I was on a varsity sport. Like, it's almost like you get so much more focused on what's really important. And there isn't the opportunity to go sit and watch soap operas because you don't have class. Like, there is no free time. I tend to feel that way professionally and personally also. I don't know if that answered your question.
That's great. And something about pressure and diamonds. I think there's some kind of quote in that, right? Like, but no, I think you're right, and I think certainly everyone's different how they react to that type of capacity or pressure. But I think certain people, I'd say me and Paul are kind of right there with you as far as less empty time seems to propel you further ahead, right?
Yes.
Well, that's great. And thanks again for being willing to share kind of some of the personal side of this. We want to spend maybe the last 5 or 10 minutes here talking about the future a little bit, or how you've thought about the future, and really not just for you personally. We'll talk about HR in general, and maybe what some of our executives that are earlier on in their career might be thinking about. But I guess we'll just start. And as far as the future for you, what are you thinking about? How are you thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, if I may, let me start with Lionbridge, just because I think HR at Lionbridge, I think everybody needs to be thinking in terms of how AI will shape the future of human resources. And every HR leader should be thinking about how AI may shape their core business that they're supporting, right? That they're actively and strategically working with. I mean, for Lionbridge, we've been on the cutting edge of AI in many different ways. We help train the algorithms for the large tech companies. We train home-assisted devices. So if you talk to, Alexa, Cortana, whoever you're talking to, she probably, or it was probably trained by Lionbridge. We've been the human in the loop on a lot of the AI technology. But the new generation of AI, I think, is going to, I think there are two things from an HR perspective. One is, how do you leverage that AI for the benefit of the HR team so that your very talented group of HR professionals can work on value add, not on what could be created by AI, right? So I think leveraging AI for human resources is going to be critical over the next period of time. And certainly for a company like Lionbridge that's been on the cutting edge of AI, we're having a lot of conversations with businesses about how it's going to affect, again, their core business. And then how do they leverage that new capability? And I think in business, it's a SWOT analysis. I'd always get all hung up on strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, because I'm always like, well, that's a threat, but isn't that really an opportunity? And I think AI is one of those things that business has to think of in terms of opportunity. And certainly where we are advising our clients when it comes to their core businesses, like, how do you leverage this? It's a tool. How do you leverage it for the benefit of your business? So that's the one thing, kind of in the near term that I think everybody should be thinking about. I mean, for me personally, as I mentioned, I'm on my 38th year. I'm turning 60 shortly. My husband and I are empty nesters now, with one daughter that's in Cambridge and one that's in Atlanta. And again, we've got one bulldog. I love what I do. I love the company I work for. I think, for me, it's hugely satisfying to see different initiatives promote the health and well-being of the company and the people that are part of it. So I really am enjoying where I am now, and until such time as I'm no longer contributing that, I am where I am. What I am doing though is I'm starting to look at more nonprofit work, not as a time filler, but from an experience standpoint, right? I've mentioned the importance of being able to talk about finance. I personally really dislike fundraising, and I'm going to make myself go do it for different nonprofits, because again, for me, from an intellectual curiosity standpoint, it's helpful to get new competencies, right? So that's a competency, and I think most nonprofits will be thrilled to have somebody who's willing to do it. So just get more involved in the nonprofit world. I think at some point I'd also begin to look at for-profit board work. I think boards generally have been concentrating really hard on people with financial backgrounds or risk management backgrounds. I think it's a gap in many boards not to have a strong senior HR experienced professional on their board, because so much of, if you're a services-based company, what you have are people, right? So, and if your board's not considering that as part of their strategy or the long-term growth of your company, I think that's a gap. So I'm offering myself up at some point. And I think that's it for me. I'm going to continue to develop successors in my organization. P.S. The fastest way to get promoted is to have a successor, always. And again, just something that I learned from a mentor that I had, which is this idea that you should always be preparing your successor in case you need to move. Then the organization will be cared for. And frankly, it's easier to move you if the company knows you've got somebody ready in the wings.
That's great advice and insight. And it's interesting. I noted that you didn't mention your Peloton prowess with the Boston HR Council Peloton group. I mean, you're almost always on every ride. You didn't mention that. I was hurt that wasn't mentioned.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I get on those rides, and my only thing is, please don't let Sean lap me twice, because that's usually where you are in comparison.
Long legs and weight, there's all kinds of weird stuff. But your attendance is great on the Peloton group. But before we sign off, and you started going here a little bit, maybe share one piece of advice for the early on HR executive person listening in here on how they might advance their career or strategically think about putting themselves in position to get that next role, right? Director to VP or VP to the C-suite. And you started talking a little bit about it, but would love to hear maybe your direct advice to those folks.
Yeah, and so I think one of the critical things that I did is, and I mentioned mentors at different points during what I said previously, and I've had a few of them, and these weren't people that were assigned to me by some program. There was nothing formal in the relationship. In fact, I get a little eked out when somebody calls and is like, "Can you mentor me?" Like I don't kind of get the formality of that. These were relationships with individuals who, that they carried an invisible knapsack of information that I didn't have access to, right? So while the relationships grew, one of them grew out of conflict, frankly. This individual and I did not get along, and I was like convinced we had to get along, and we figured out a way, and we reached a separate peace. And what I realized was he actually was a terrific mentor for kind of how to talk to people who are super logic oriented. I'm not when I communicate logic oriented. And he was a terrific mentor on even the most basic questions. I remember going into him early in my career, and I said, "Listen, what's equity?" Like I'd never heard the word. I didn't understand it. And he very patiently went on to explain what equity was. But a mentor is someone with whom you can be very genuine, with whom you can admit you don't know, who may have information that you don't otherwise have access to. And it may be about a style. It may be about an actual, core piece of knowledge around, finance or whatever it is that you don't know. What I find fascinating when I look back at my own mentors is there was a range of them, from a diversity perspective, which is very near and dear to my heart. Whether it was a white middle-aged ex-Marine who led loss prevention for Macy's, or an African-American woman who had her PhD in bio and organic chemistry, who led a very large consumer packaged goods division, or a much younger and smarter marketing professional. Like, I think it's really important to open yourself up to a wide variety of relationships all over your company and get the benefit of knowledge, and be intellectually curious, and be open, and be, reflect on who you are and what you're ready to do or not ready to do. Those mentors sort of swimming along with you as you're moving upstream, I think is critically important. And don't forget to mentor back. There's no more, mentor coming from on high, giving lots of information, lofty information. It's reciprocal. And these individuals are still wonderful friends. I even feel funny calling them mentors at this point. They're really more friends than anything else. But my point is, open yourself up. And then also look for mentors with people that you don't necessarily get along with, interestingly, because the ones with whom you have conflict probably have the most information that you need.
Well, amazing advice, and for folks listening. And just want to say thank you so much for spending some time with us today. You've been an amazing council member, an amazing friend, and I just had a great time today.
Same. Thank you so much, both of you, and thank you for the idea. I love the topic, and if I can be of any more help to the council or any of your members, certainly let me know.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann.